Hello there, and welcome to this week's edition of Money Matters, because after all, as you know, money does matter. Welcome to the south of France, to the slightly cloudy south of France. What I want to talk to you about today is the budget. The most important thing that we need to understand is the overall context in which the budget took place. It is straight after the lockdown being lifted, furlough ended in September, and there were all these predictions of, mass unemployment and all that other stuff, and it just didn't happen. So here is point number one. And the first point I want to talk about is actually before the budget and massive government debt as a result of huge intervention, the furlough scheme, various loan schemes and so on, to keep the economy ticking along as it was locked down. Now let's put that into the context of government debt as a percentage of GDP. So briefly, what's GDP? GDP is the total value of all the goods and services of gross domestic product. So it's almost like, what's the turnover of UK PLC?
Oh, debt is incredibly high.
Well, yes. So if we go back to the early 2000s, what was government debt, the percentage of GDP, before the 2008-2009 crash? Well, it was about 35%. After the 2008-2009 crash, it was 48-50% roughly. And then after this, year and a half of lockdown or whatever, unsurprisingly, it is over 100%. Everyone's going,
ooh, it's unsustainably high. It's all going to crash. It's all going to end in tears.
Well, just have a look at this chart here. This chart goes back hundreds of years, and you can see in the early 1800s that government debt spiked massively more than it is today. After the First World War, look at that for another 40 odd years, and look at that after the Second World War. In the context of recent history, debt as a percent of GDP is high, I'll give you that, but in the context of history, it's not. Okay, and point number two. Before we even start talking about the budget, let's just remind ourselves that the government took some pretty significant action before the budget. Two things I want to pick up on: national insurance and dividends. In theory, the increase in national insurance and tax on dividends, 1.25%. So anytime anybody pretty much earns anything, or anytime a shareholder draws dividend from a company, they've all gone up by 1.25%, plus the national insurance. That is going to raise a lot of money for the government. So even before we got to the budget, the government's got ways to start repaying some of this lockdown money, let's call it that. Okay, so point number three, and this is part of the pre-budget announcement. It kind of sets out the background against which the government expects the budget to play out over the next year or so. And they're now saying that versus a long-run target of 2% inflation, that is, their expectation is that over the next year or so, it's going to be more like 4%. So initially they were saying, like the Americans, this inflation is transitory, it's going to work its way out the system. Another saying, it might be here for a bit longer. Now, as a property investor, so let's come at this from a property investor's point of view, is that good or bad? I think it's probably going to be more like 5.5%, possibly 6%, because inflation is personal, depends what you do. All of us, pretty much, unless we want to live in an igloo or something, are going to get bashed by 20-30% increase in gas prices next year. So how can inflation only be 4 or 5% when gas prices are going to go up by 20 or 30%? It's because inflation is measured off a basket of things, and gas prices is just one of them. But I have to say, petrol prices have been shooting up. Yeah, so energy generally has been shooting up. Food is shooting up. So I wouldn't be at all surprised that the average rate of increase is more like 5 to 6%. So let's just use 5% as a working number. I've just remortgaged my home in Doncaster. I think it was 1.48%. Now, the cost of money, therefore, to acquire property is 1.48%. What it was for us for that particular property. It means the value of your debt, your mortgages, if that's getting destroyed at the rate of 5 or 6% a year in terms of its purchasing power. So in other words, to repay it, it's going to cost you real money equivalent in 1 year's time, 5% less, in 2 years' time, 10% less. Let's forget the compounding for now. But if it hit 6%, that's a magic number, because that means every 12 years, the value of your debt in real terms would halve. All the time that interest rates are significantly below inflation rates, it's a fantastic time to be a property investor. Money's never been so cheap, and property prices are going up fast. Inflation being above the interest rate that you're paying is destroying the value of your debt. I hope that makes sense, and that is great news for property investors. And number 4, this is the property development tax. This is aimed at what the government calls large developers. This is anyone making more than 25 million from property. Well, they're going to pay this 4% additional tax, and in theory this is supposed to be somewhat a compensation package for all those poor people with cladding issues on their blocks of flats. And what they're doing is they're linking it and they said, well, the people that built these things are the bigger developers. Therefore, what we're going to do is we're going to put this tax on bigger developers, and they're defining that as 25 million and over. I'm not really seeing that impacting what we're doing. That's more your sort of Taylor Wimpey or whatever type developer. But if you're making profit and it's a 4% extra tax on your profit, well, you're not going to pay any tax if you're not making any profit. So, argue about whether it's fair or not. So it's kind of interesting. My feeling is it could take quite a long time to fix that problem if they're only getting 4% from some developers, but whatever. Number 5, corporation tax, don't we all love it? Is in the process of going up from 19% to 25% by 2023. So that's not really news. That policy was announced a while ago now. And you've got the exceptions if you're not a large company. So again, is it a reason not to do property investing? No. And is it a reason not to do property investing in a limited company? No. And 25% by international standards is not high. Okay, so number 6, business rates relief. Anything you do that's green to your property, like solar panels and whatever, you can actually get extra release for, which is great. And that's all in the context of ongoing efforts to reduce the amount of pollution in the atmosphere, to reduce the impact on climate change. So I think we can expect to see a bit of a carrot and stick on this for the next probably 7 or 8 years. Anything that increases energy efficiency, I think we're going to get incentivized by, but we're also going to get clobbered by further increases in minimum EPC rating. So the fact that there's some green taxes and some green benefits is not particularly shocking. There we go, that's number 6. Number 7, 50% discounted business rate, people in the hospitality sector up to £100,000. So this is a major biggie. To get your business rates reduced by like a half, there's no if, buts or maybes on that. And the Chancellor in particular has been pretty good about supporting the high street. I don't mean literally the high street, I just mean the commercial property sector, because by stopping people going into shops and offices and cafes and so on, that sector has been pretty adversely impacted. So that's a good thing if you're a commercial landlord. So well done, and thank you for that. Let's move on to the next one. This is a really brief one. So capital gains tax not changed, or at least not yet. There was talk about changes to capital gains tax, and obviously we're the 10% surcharge for property. That's fair, isn't it? At least it hasn't got any worse. So there was some noise about it, and it didn't really happen. Number 9, private pensions have not been touched. Well, it hasn't been touched in a bad way, but conversely it hasn't been touched in a good way either. The lifetime allowance, it's just a touch over £1,070,000, and you might think, well, £1 million, that's a lot of money, tax, in your pension fund. Yeah, but now go and look at how much a £1 million plus would buy you as an annuity. Now, it depends what kind of annuity, you read the right kind of advice and so on, but depending on your age, your health and so on, it's not difficult to imagine that your annuity rate might be 3%. Now, 3% on £1 million is 30 grand a year. Now, I don't consider £30,000 a year to be excessively high. I don't particularly perceive it to be an incredibly high limit. I conceive it to be a kind of, well, all right, if that's the best you can do. And obviously, using commercial property like I do, I get a lot more than 3%. My average return from my pension is 12.5. So if I've got £1 million in there and somebody did what I'm doing, then they could reasonably expect like, £125,000 a year, which would be more than £10,000 a month. I don't know how I feel about this one, really. Alcohol duty. Why have I put that in here? Well, he simplified it, which is good, always good. I've got to declare that I spent many years as operations director for Whitbread Beer Company, so I made a lot of beer. After that, I was managing director of a spirits company, so I've been very involved in the alcohol industry, and I've been scratching my head over the years for just, why is that? So if alcohol is alcohol, it's alcohol. And if it comes from grain versus it comes from a grape versus it comes from a whatever, it used to be that all the tax rates were different. So that's why, White Lightning cider, or whatever it's called, not that I've ever drunk any, was dirt cheap because of the way the alcohol was produced. Whereas something like Scotch whisky, which is considered to be premium, would pay a disproportionately higher amount, even though the alcohol level was the same, just because of the way it was produced. I think that's interesting because, if I've understood it correctly, he's levelling it up. In other words, the cheap stuff is going to get more expensive and the more expensive stuff should stay roughly where it is, if that makes sense. I think he's moving in the same direction as the government's done with tobacco over the years. And personally, I've never been a smoker. I think that's a really good thing. Price definitely dampens demand. How is that going to impact on being a landlord? Well, there are a percentage of landlords that look after people with alcohol dependency. I just think we need to watch that space as to what it does. But it might just be something you want to keep a little bit of an eye on, a watching brief, if you like, with regard to social housing or halfway houses and that sort of thing. Anyway, this is where you're going to see me quite excited and quite agitated. Now, why am I so excited about number 11? Because it's the most important, and because, for me, it's the most underreported. So what is it? So the annual investment allowance, or the bit that I'm interested in, is a subset of annual investment allowance, which is called capital allowances. And if you invest in service accommodation or commercial property, then annual investment allowance is critical. Because normally, annual investment allowance, I'm saying normally, over the longer term, it's been possible to use it to earn £200,000 a year tax-free per person. What happened a few years ago now is the Chancellor said, oh, well, we need to stimulate investment in the economy, we need to pick up business lending and all that kind of stuff. So what we're going to do is we're going to increase that annual investment allowance to £1 million per person per year, and that can be carried forward. So in other words, if you've got capital allowance of £1 million this year, what that means is you could earn £1 million this year tax-free, or you could earn £500,000 this year tax-free and £500,000 next year, or 10 times 100, or whatever. If you're interested in it because it's $1 million, it means you're earning a lot of money. So for property investors that have become wealthy through property over the years, and they've got a lot of property, then the fact that the temporary lift on the annual investment allowance was due to run out this year, and now the extension to the temporary measure has been carried through all the way to March 2023. So that means per person, per year, if you know how to structure it, you can make £1 million profit through property using the right kinds of property investment strategy, the right kind of structure, and each of you, plus your partners, whatever, per person can have £1 million tax-free. So if you don't know how to get £1 million tax-free, and if this is like, what, are you serious? £1 million tax-free? You off your head, Paul? No. And it's one of the things I write about in Wealth Through Property, because I'm sure that you would agree with me that it's not it isn't what you make, it's what you keep after taxes that's actually important to you, to your loved ones, to your family, or at least that's my belief. So in the link below this video, please ask any questions you've got about the budget. And also, if you want to not only read about Wealth Through Property, I'm sure there'll be a link down there where you can get yourself a copy of the book. If you want to come along to our signature event, which is 2 days talking about Wealth Through Property online, it's just easier these days, isn't it, online? Then click the link below, get yourself a ticket, like this video if you haven't liked it already, subscribe, don't miss another episode. You've been wonderful, I've been Paul, see you next time.